All right, we're going to be picking up where we left off with our last section of notes, and we were talking about blood type in humans. And so just to quick review that, blood typing in humans has two different parts to it, the first of which is called the Rh factor, and that's just either a positive or a negative tag that goes on to the blood type. And so just like our other Punnett squares, being a dominant recessive portion, you can either have the positive form is either two positive alleles, being homozygous for the positive alleles, or heterozygous, since that's the dominant trait. And having the negative portion of blood typing requires two recessive alleles for that. And then that Rh, again, just is because it was first discovered in the rhesus monkey, that's why they call it the Rh factor. And so the other portion of the blood types is called the ABO group. And so with that ABO group, you can either have an A, an AB, a B, or a type O, and all of those because of A and B groups are co-dominant. So that's why we can get an AB group as opposed to just an A or a B. And so the I, which is represented by this I letter, is the recessive allele, and that is the type O blood. So I know it gets a little confusing when your type O blood is used by an I allele, but that's the way that they set these up. And so these are determined by what antigen they produce. And the antigen is just the marker on the blood cell. And inside your body, your cells recognize the specific antigens, and that's how your blood cells are able to transport oxygen and then function with the rest of the cells in your body. And so with those antigens, again, type A blood is going to only produce type A antigens. So if you have type A blood, you only have type A antigens inside your body. If you have type B blood, same type of thing, it only produces type B antigens. So with the blood typing being co-dominant with A and B, when you have type AB blood, you are producing both the type A antigens and the type B antigens. So you get kind of a combination of the both, and that way, when you need a blood donate or when you need to have a blood transfusion, you can get both type A blood or type B blood because your body already has both of those type of antigens in your blood cells, so your body would not recognize those as being something that it doesn't want in there. And with the type I or the type O blood, you do not produce any antigens. So if we take a look at each of those blood groups, A, B, AB, and type O, you can see with the different genotypes what are created from those. So IA, having the dominant allele with that recessive O, still gives you type A blood, or it can be homozygous for two capital A's. Type B, these same combinations can be heterozygous or homozygous. Type AB can only be heterozygous, having both a type A allele and a type B allele. And then finally, type O can only be created by having the two recessive alleles, giving you the type O blood. AB just means that you have one of each of those alleles, and then you also have two of the Rh factor alleles. And so that will either then determine if it's a AB positive or an AB negative. So most common blood types in the United States, you can see O positive is the most common type, A positive being the second most common, and those two are by a very high portion. Those make up over almost 80% of the total blood types in the United States. And you can see the least common is AB negative over here with 0.6%. So that's the very, very small portion of the population that has that type of blood. So we're going to look at this problem showing a woman that is heterozygous for type A blood marrying a man that has type AB blood. In order to set this up, and of course we're only looking at half of the actual blood type because we don't have the Rh factor included, but that we would just tag on then as we finish up. So type A blood that is heterozygous is obviously going to be a type A allele. Since it's heterozygous, it will have the recessive type O allele. And the man who is AB blood will have an A allele and a type B allele. So as we set it up this way, I'm going to step over the board real quick and fill this in. And so you can see our combinations that are created from this Punnett square type crossing these two individuals. And so when we create our ratios, we end up with a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, having homozygous type A, heterozygous type A type AB, and then a type B. And so when we look at our phenotypes, these two individuals would be type A blood, we'd have a type AB, and one individual is type B blood. So we get a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of our phenotypes, and we end up with a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio of our genotypes. Okay, now we're going to move forward into looking at some recessive alleles that can create some genetic disorder. So most disorders are caused by recessive alleles. If they're caused by a dominant allele, it's more likely that they would get removed from a population because they may kill off that portion of the population that has that dominant allele. But because it's recessive, it still can pop back up into generations in the future. So a couple of those examples: albinism, cystic fibrosis, galactosemia, phenylketonuria, or normally just called PKU, and then the last of which is Tay-Sachs disease. And so these 5 disorders can be found on page 345 in your book. And in the future, we will be testing on each of these specifically, or you'll be possibly seeing questions on each of these individual disorders. So it is a good idea to do a little bit of research on these, and we are going to cover them a little bit in the notes, but you need to know that these are for sure that these are the recessive disorders. And so the first of which, albinism, we talked about it in class, going through some examples of pedigree, just a lack of pigment in your skin, your hair, and your eye color. And so it doesn't really affect the health at all, just alters what the pigment is in those individuals. The next one, cystic fibrosis, ends up creating a lot of mucus in the lungs, and the reason for this is that your body cannot break down your DNA does not create the correct protein to break down this mucus, so it starts to accumulate in the lungs and then ends up creating pneumonia a lot of times and infections, so it ends up causing a lot of health problems with people that have cystic fibrosis. And so later on in this unit, we'll talk about cystic fibrosis in a little bit more detail. Next one, galactosemia, accumulation of galactose, and so that's similar to some of the products in milk, and so you just can't break that down. Similar to how cystic fibrosis works, just slows your ability to break down and get rid of certain materials, and a little bit more damaging in younger individuals because it causes a lot of issues with brain development. Next one, PKU, or phenylketonuria, is phenylalanine in the tissue, or accumulation of phenylalanine in the tissues. And again, this is just genetics cannot produce a specific protein to get rid of this material. And so this also ends up creating a lack of skin pigment or normal skin pigment. You sometimes get blotch skin color, but similar to albinism, you'd get an alteration of that skin color. And the last of the recessive alleles is Tay-Sachs disease. And with Tay-Sachs, it ends up with accumulation of fat in your brain cells when you're very young, so it ends up often creating a relatively low life expectancy. So kids don't usually live to be more than 15 to 20 years old. In some cases they can, but it really decreases the likelihood of that. Again, the main thing, death early on in childhood in most cases. All right, so I'm moving on to dominant alleles. And again, this is still from the same chart on page 345 in your books. And so with some of the dominant alleles, again, these are just like the recessive alleles. We either have dominant or recessive. But with these ones, they sometimes aren't as life-threatening, at least not until later on in life, once the individuals can pass on these genetics or have children. So they usually end up creating some issues, but not most until later on in life. So a couple of these: achondroplasia, which is dwarfism; Huntington's disease, which normally affects individuals more in the likelihood of like their 30s to 40s. Oops, wrong direction. And then last one, hypercholesterolemia, which is kind of the number one factor to create heart disease, which is the number one killer in the United States and for a majority of the world. And so with each of these, quadriplegia is just one form of dwarfism. And so again, this is a dominant allele, and there's a show on TLC showing two individuals that have dwarfism, and then they have kids. They both end up being heterozygous, so some of their kids are of normal height, even though both their parents have dwarfism. So there's one instance where we can see the dominant, and especially heterozygous form being present in those individuals. Next one, Huntington's disease. It's a slower breakdown of the brain once you enter your 30s, and then also uncontrollable movements of your body. And so it ends up creating a lot of problems with people once they get to their 30s and 40s. And then the last of which, that hypercholesterolemia, is extra cholesterol, again causing heart disease, and again that's the number one cause of death in the United States. And so that is caused obviously with heart disease. And so that is where we're going to end with the notes today. So we'll pick up with the codominant alleles later on, probably next week.